decision, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the empty house like a loud declaration. Her eyes were wide, tears barely contained as she stood on the threshold, her hand frozen on the doorknob. The cold evening air seemed to bite her skin, but it was nothing compared to the sting in her heart. Her father's face remained impassive, his voice cold and final. "You can't stay here anymore. Pack your things and go. You're nothing but trouble." He didn't even flinch as she turned to face him, her face pale, her lips trembling with words she couldn't bring herself to say. His words were like daggers, sharp and unforgiving, each one cutting deeper than the last. She had never expected it to end this way, never imagined that the man who had been her protector, her source of comfort, would be the one to drive her out. I don't understand, Dad." "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But he didn't answer. He simply stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes locked on hers with a coldness she had never seen before. The man who had raised her was a stranger now, and the weight of his rejection was heavier than anything she had ever experienced. Her world seemed to collapse around her in that single moment. It was as though the ground beneath her feet had vanished, leaving her to fall into an abyss of uncertainty and pain. And yet, in the back of her mind, there was a thought that wouldn't go away. Maybe, just maybe, this was the best thing that could happen. Maybe this was a chance for her to prove herself, to find out who she really was without the suffocating grip of a father's expectations. But the tears that now ran down her cheeks spoke a different truth. The truth that she wasn't ready for this, that she had been cast out, left to navigate a world that was far too big and intimidating for someone as fragile as she felt in that moment. "Leave now," her father said, his voice as cold as ice. His eyes never softened. He didn't even look at her as she gathered the few belongings she had. There was no warm goodbye, no parting words of encouragement, just an emptiness that lingered, like a wound that wouldn't heal. She stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her, the finality of it all hitting her like a thunderclap. Her father, the man who had shaped her world, had pushed her away. The house she had grown up in, the place that had once felt like home, now felt like a prison from which she had been released, only to be cast into the cold, unfeeling world. As she walked away, a single question haunted her: how could he do this? How could he turn his back on her so easily? And yet, as the silence of the night pressed in around her, she realized something else too. The answer, whatever it might be, wouldn't come from him. It would have to come from her. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with pain and hardship, but it was hers to make. The only thing she knew for sure was that it had begun. And the decision her father had made would change both their lives forever. The nights grew colder, and the streets darker as the days passed. With nothing but a small bag slung over her shoulder, she wandered through the unfamiliar city, unsure of where to go or what to do. She had been sent out into the world with nothing but her pride and the vague hope that somehow, things would get better. But deep down, she knew the harsh truth: no one was going to offer her a hand. Not in the way she needed. Her mind raced with the sting of her father's rejection. The words echoed in her mind like a constant drumbeat: "You're nothing but trouble." She had never imagined that those words would define her reality, but they had. It felt like the world had already decided what kind of person she was, and she had no say in the matter. It wasn't long before she found herself in a rundown part of town. The streetlights flickered weakly overhead, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. There was a part of her that still wanted to run back home, to beg for forgiveness, to ask for the love and security that had once been hers. But she couldn't. Her pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, she found herself at a small, dingy diner, the kind of place that seemed to be stuck in time, never quite moving forward. She sat down at the counter, the grease-stained menu before her as she tried to collect her thoughts. The waitress gave her a look of sympathy before walking away. There was no room for pity in her world anymore. No one would understand the weight of what she had lost, not even the strangers sitting around her. The days blended into weeks, and the loneliness became a constant companion. She found a small job, cleaning houses for an elderly woman who didn't say much but paid her well. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. It gave her a chance to focus on something other than the relentless ache in her chest. Still, each day felt like a struggle to stay afloat in a world that seemed indifferent to her existence. The harder she worked, the more she began to change. The girl who had once been hopeful, filled with dreams of a future full of love and acceptance, was slowly replaced by someone more guarded, more determined to survive. She didn't have time for fantasies or wishes anymore. The world had shown her its cruel side, and now, she was going to show it hers. But there were moments, fleeting moments, when the memory of her father would creep into her thoughts. The way he had looked at her before pushing her out the door, the emptiness in his eyes as though he had already written her off. It was these moments that hurt the most, the ones that left her questioning everything she had once believed about family, love, and loyalty. She hadn't heard from him. Not a call, not a letter, nothing. It was as though she had never existed in his world. But somehow, she kept going. She couldn't stop now. She had to prove something, prove to herself that she wasn't nothing. One day, after finishing her work for the day, she stood on the corner of a busy street, watching people rush by. The world seemed to move in a blur, a constant motion that had no time for a girl like her. But she didn't mind. She had learned how to disappear into the background, how to become part of the noise, unnoticed. It was safer that way. Yet, deep down, she couldn't help but wonder, what if he had made a mistake? What if, in kicking her out, he had destroyed something that could never be fixed? The thought haunted her, but she shoved it aside. She couldn't afford to care. Not anymore. The past was gone, and all that mattered now was survival. It wasn't easy. It wasn't glamorous. But every small victory, every day she made it through, proved to her that she was stronger than the world gave her credit for. The struggle, while painful, was the only thing she had left to hold on to. And somehow, she would keep going. Years had passed since the day he kicked his daughter out, but the memory of it never left him. Every morning, he woke up to a life that felt hollow. His career had soared, his wealth grew, and his life seemed to be everything he had once dreamed of. But in the quiet moments, when the hustle and bustle of the world slowed down, a deep emptiness settled within him. The house was bigger now, with grander furniture, a beautiful view, and everything money could buy. But it didn't feel like home. It felt like a mansion filled with echoes, the ghost of a family that had been torn apart by his own hand. He had moved on, at least, that's what he told himself. The pain of his decision had faded with time, replaced by the cold comfort of success. Yet, he knew something wasn't right. Sometimes, late at night, when the weight of the day lifted, he would sit alone in his study, staring at an old picture of his daughter. It had been taken during one of their family vacations years ago, before everything fell apart. She had been so full of life, smiling brightly at the camera, her eyes full of hope and love. He remembered how they used to talk about her future, her dreams, her ambitions. But none of those dreams mattered anymore, not in his world. The guilt had settled in his chest like a heavy stone, never allowing him to forget what he had done. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt, it was the fact that he had done it without understanding her side of things, without truly listening. He had been so focused on his own frustration, so consumed by his own disappointments, that he couldn't see the pain he was inflicting on her. But he wouldn't admit that to anyone. Not even to himself. In the world of high-stakes business meetings and expensive dinners, vulnerability was a weakness he couldn't afford. He had built a fortress around his emotions, keeping them hidden away behind a facade of power and control. Still, the feeling of emptiness never went away. His success meant little when there was no one to share it with. His friends were all transactional, people who needed something from him or whom he could use for his own gain. He had no true connections, no one who would stand by him when the world came crashing down. No family. The silence in the house was deafening. His wife had left years ago, unable to live in the cold, lonely mansion he had created. She had said she wanted a family, not just wealth, but he hadn't understood what she meant. Now, with her gone, there was nothing left but the house, empty and cold, like his heart. Sometimes, his mind would wander back to that day, to the day he had told her to leave. He thought about the words he had said to her, about how harsh and final they had been. He had been angry, but it wasn't just anger. There had been a certain bitterness, a sense of finality that he couldn't explain. It had been as if he was convinced that her departure would solve something, that it would ease the pressure he had been feeling. But nothing changed. In fact, everything felt worse. The years without her had only reinforced the truth that he couldn't escape, the truth that, deep down, he knew he had made the biggest mistake of his life. His world was filled with material things, but none of it mattered. None of it could fill the void that her absence had left. He had everything a man could want, but nothing that truly mattered. And now, as he sat alone in his study, his fingers grazing the picture frame, he realized with gut-wrenching clarity that his daughter was gone, perhaps for good. And he could never take back the decision that had cost him the most important person in his life. The realization came slowly, painfully: his wealth, his success, his career, none of it could fix what he had broken. His regret was his alone to bear. It had been years, and the streets of the city had changed. The familiar landmarks he once drove past every day now seemed different, as if time had altered the very fabric of the world around him. But that was the way things worked, he thought. Time moved on. And people? People just had to keep up. He was on his usual evening walk, the cool breeze against his face, trying to clear his mind after a long day. His life, as successful as it had been, had started to feel like a series of motions: wake up, work, eat, sleep. The lack of real connection in his life was suffocating. No amount of wealth or accomplishments could erase the nagging emptiness inside him. He passed, and in that moment, he realized something painfully clear: he couldn't just apologize and expect things to be fixed. Too much had happened. Too much had been broken. Yet, still, he couldn't help but hope that this chance encounter might be the first step toward something more. Toward healing. But was it too late? Could he ever repair the damage he had caused? The silence lingered, and the weight of those unanswered questions pressed down on him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: this moment was the beginning of something neither of them could have anticipated. The silence between them hung heavy, thick with years of unspoken pain, regrets, and lost opportunities. Her eyes studied him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as though every flaw, every mistake he had ever made was laid bare before her. He could see the guarded expression on her face, the hesitation that told him she was far from ready to forgive, or even to accept the apology he had offered so weakly. She didn't speak for a long while. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, her gaze flickering between him and the window, as though she was considering whether or not she should just walk away, to escape from this painful moment. He couldn't blame her if she did. After all, what was there to say? What could he possibly offer that would make up for the years he had taken from her? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but there was a certain firmness to it, an edge that came from years of self-preservation. "You don't even recognize me, do you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as if testing him, pushing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. He blinked, confused. "What? Of course, I do," but then he stopped himself, realizing how ridiculous his words sounded. He hadn't truly looked at her. Not the way a father should look at his child. He had only seen the image of a daughter in his mind, frozen in time, someone who had simply faded away from his life. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. "You look different," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. But, you still have that same fire in your eyes. That same spark that used to make me proud. Her lips curled into something that was almost a smile, but it was tinged with bitterness. It's funny, she said, the sarcasm in her voice barely hidden, you remember the spark, but not the years that followed. The pain, the loneliness. You never once wondered if I was okay. If I was surviving. His heart sank. She was right. He had never asked himself those questions. He had convinced himself that kicking her out was the right decision, that she would be fine on her own. But the reality of it hit him like a brick. He had abandoned her, left her to face the world alone, and now, years later, all that was left was the wreckage of that decision. I didn't think, he began, his voice faltering. I thought I was doing what was best. I thought it would make you stronger, that you'd learn something from it. But I was wrong. Her eyes hardened. You don't get it, do you? It wasn't about what you thought was best for me. It was about what you needed. Your frustration, your anger, you used me as your scapegoat. I was just the one who was there, the easiest target to blame when things weren't going your way. The words stung, but they were true. He had been selfish, thinking only of his own feelings without considering the emotional toll it would take on her. He had convinced himself that he was the victim in the situation, that she was the one who had somehow failed him. I never saw it that way, he murmured, almost ashamed to admit it. The realization of how wrong he had been washed over him, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own life. I know, she said, her voice softening just a little. But that doesn't change what happened, does it? The truth of her words hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't been prepared for. The years, the distance, the silence, none of it could be erased. There was no magic apology that could undo the damage he had caused. His mistakes were carved into the past, etched into their history in a way that couldn't be erased. But there was something else in her eyes now, something he hadn't expected. There was pain, yes, but also a flicker of something else. Maybe, just maybe, the door to reconciliation wasn't completely shut. Maybe there was still hope for them. For the first time in years, he dared to believe it. He didn't know how things would play out, how long it would take to rebuild what had been broken. But as he looked at his daughter, sitting before him, her walls still intact but not impenetrable, he realized that the journey to healing had to start somewhere. And this chance encounter, this painful but necessary conversation, might just be the first step. The air between them was still thick with tension, but something had shifted. For the first time in years, the father didn't feel like he was speaking into an abyss. There was a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could start again. I know I've made mistakes, he began slowly, his voice steady but filled with regret. I know I've hurt you in ways that I can never undo. He swallowed hard, the words coming slower than he had anticipated. It was as if each sentence was a struggle against the years of distance and pride that had kept them apart. But I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I was so focused on my own feelings that I couldn't see what I was doing to you. His voice broke slightly as he spoke the words he had been denying for so long. Sorry. He had been too proud to say it before, too wrapped up in his own justifications. But now, facing the daughter he had driven away, he realized that nothing he had ever accomplished in his life mattered more than the relationship they had lost. She didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained steady, but there was a coldness to it, as though she were still protecting herself from the words he had spoken. The walls she had built around her were too high, too thick to be brought down with a few simple sentences. And he knew that. I don't expect you to forgive me, he added quickly, his voice more urgent now. I don't expect things to just go back to the way they were. I understand if you can't forgive me. I've done too much damage. There was a silence that followed, the kind that felt like it might swallow them whole. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to somehow convey the depth of his regret, but he knew it wasn't that simple. He knew that after all these years, action spoke louder than words. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but sharp. "You don't get to decide how this goes. I get to decide if I want to forgive you." She leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing over her chest. "I'm not some child anymore, waiting for you to come back and make everything okay. I've had to fight for everything I have. I've built my own life, my own future." The bitterness in her voice was evident, and it hurt him more than he could have imagined. But it was also the truth. She was no longer the girl he had kicked out of his house all those years ago. She had grown into someone strong, someone who had learned how to survive without him. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "And I'm sorry for taking that away from you. I never wanted to take your independence. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't know how to be a father. I thought I was doing what was best for you. But all I did was hurt you." Her eyes softened slightly, just enough for him to notice. It was a small shift, but to him, it felt like a crack in the wall that had separated them for so long. "You were just a man lost in his own pride," she said quietly. "And I was just a girl trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. But I survived. I found my way. I didn't need you to rescue me." The words stung, but they were also a reminder of how far she had come. She had survived without him. And in a way, that made her stronger than he ever could have imagined. "I'm proud of you," he said softly, a tear slipping down his cheek despite himself. "You've become someone I could never have imagined. Someone far better than I ever deserved." For a moment, there was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't as suffocating. It was the kind of silence that comes before something shifts, before something new begins. She didn't offer him a smile or a hug. She didn't need to. But for the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they could start to rebuild, even if it took a long time. He had no illusions that forgiveness would come easily. But he was ready to try. Ready to be the father he should have been all those years ago. And in that quiet moment, he understood that the journey to healing had begun, not with grand gestures or perfect words, but with the simple, painful truth of facing the past. The rest would come in time. The days following their encounter were a blur of emotions for both of them. The initial tension had begun to fade, but there was still a long road ahead. The daughter hadn't forgiven him yet, not completely, at least, but something had shifted. There was a tentative openness in her demeanor now, something that hadn't been there before. And for the first time in years, the father felt a glimmer of hope, fragile though it was. They met again, this time in a small park where the trees were just beginning to bud with the promise of spring. It was a neutral place, away from the echoes of their past, a quiet space where they could talk without the weight of the old house or the city surrounding them. The father arrived early, sitting on a bench by the fountain, his heart racing as he waited for her. He didn't know what to expect, but he had come to understand that he could no longer control this situation. He had made his apology, and now it was up to her. When she arrived, she was different. Her posture was a little more relaxed, and there was less of the guarded expression he had seen the last time. But her eyes still held that same wariness, as if she were waiting for him to prove himself. "Hey," she greeted him, offering a small but sincere smile. "Hey," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He wanted to say more, but the words were tangled in his throat. After everything that had passed between them, it felt almost surreal to be sitting here with her, to have this moment where the past didn't define their every move. They sat together in silence for a few moments, the sounds of the park, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, filling the space between them. It was peaceful, in a way. And for the first time, he felt a little of the weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew he had to keep trying. I know you're still angry with me, he said quietly, breaking the silence. And I don't blame you. I don't expect things to go back to normal overnight. But I need you to know. I am so sorry for everything I did. I know I can't undo it. But if there's any way for us to move forward, I'll do whatever it takes. She turned to look at him, her eyes softening just a little. The anger was still there, but it wasn't as sharp as before. There was something else now, something more complex. She didn't say anything for a while, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like they were both taking the time to process what had happened. You hurt me more than I can put into words, she said finally, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything she had lived through. I don't think you'll ever understand how much. But I've also spent a lot of years being angry. And I'm tired of holding on to that anger. It's not helping me. It's just keeping me stuck. Her words hit him like a wave, and for the first time, he understood the depth of the damage he had caused. It wasn't just about his mistakes, it was about how those mistakes had shaped her, how they had shaped the person she had become. And yet, as painful as it was, there was a sense of relief in her voice, too. A letting go of something that had been weighing her down for far too long. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, she continued, looking down at her hands for a moment before meeting his gaze again. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to start again, even if it's slow, even if it's hard. His chest tightened with emotion. She was offering him a chance he didn't deserve, but a chance nonetheless. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't an immediate return to the father-daughter relationship he had once hoped for. But it was something. And it was more than he had expected. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me that chance. I won't take it for granted. I promise you. They sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing at all. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened, it was about taking the first steps towards something new, something real. They both knew it wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, was a long road to rebuild. But for the first time in years, there was hope. As they said their goodbyes and walked away from each other that day, the father felt lighter than he had in a long time. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it had begun. And that, in itself, was enough. For the daughter, it wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future, about giving herself the space to heal, to forgive, and to move forward. She didn't have all the answers, but she was willing to take the next step. And that, too, was enough. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real. And sometimes, that's all you need. The weeks that followed their conversation in the park were filled with small but significant changes. There were no dramatic moments, no grand gestures. Instead, the rebuilding of their relationship took place in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. They saw each other more often, slowly easing into the comfort of shared time without the weight of old expectations. The father had done his best to prove his sincerity. He was careful with his words, conscious of the years of pain his actions had caused. Every day, he tried to show her that he was committed to making things right. But he knew it would take time. Trust wasn't something that could be restored overnight. For her part, the daughter was learning to let go of the walls she had built over the years. She didn't expect to forget the past, but she was starting to understand that forgiveness wasn't about erasing everything, it was about moving forward, step by step. She didn't rush herself, but she allowed herself to hope. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild the connection they had lost. One afternoon, the father invited her to lunch at a small cafe, the same one where they had met not long ago. The place had become a symbol of their new beginning, a space where they could be together without the shadows of the past looming over them. As they sat down, he could see that she was still hesitant, her posture a little stiff, but there was a gentleness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence as they both sipped their drinks. "I've spent so many years thinking about what I lost. But I've realized that the only thing I need to focus on now is what I have. And what I have, is you." She looked at him, her lips curling into a small, tentative smile. "I don't need you to keep apologizing," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for that. I want you to show me. Show me that you've changed, that you're not the same person you were before." He nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I understand. I know that's the only way I can prove myself to you." For the first time in years, the father didn't feel burdened by guilt. He still carried the weight of his mistakes, but it no longer consumed him. The realization that they were slowly rebuilding their bond, piece by piece, gave him hope for the future. It was a long road, but it was worth every step. Over time, they began to open up to each other more. They shared stories of their lives, the things they had missed during the years apart. The father learned about the struggles she had faced, the triumphs she had achieved without him. He listened, really listened, to the woman she had become, and for the first time, he understood just how much she had grown. She, in turn, saw the man he had become. The man who had once been so consumed by pride and ambition, but who was now humble, remorseful, and willing to do whatever it took to make things right. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be, but he was trying. And that effort meant everything to her. They started small traditions, shared meals, walks in the park, even simple phone calls just to check in. There was no rush. No pressure. They were allowing their relationship to unfold naturally, without expectations of perfection. And it was enough. But even in the midst of this healing, the daughter knew that there would always be scars. The wounds of the past were too deep to forget entirely. However, she was learning to live with them. She was learning that forgiveness didn't mean erasing the past, it meant acknowledging it, accepting it, and choosing to move forward despite it. One evening, as they sat together in the park, the father reached over and placed his hand gently on hers. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She looked at him, and for the first time, she felt the weight of all the years they had lost, but she also felt something else, peace. It wasn't the peace of perfection or of things magically being fixed. It was the peace that came from understanding, from knowing that they were both trying, and that was enough. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said softly, her fingers brushing against his. "Me too," he replied, his voice full of emotion. "Me too." And so, with each passing day, they took small steps toward rebuilding the relationship they had once lost. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt and hesitation. But they kept moving forward. Together. As the seasons changed, so did their bond. It grew stronger, steadier, built not on the idea of perfection, but on the understanding that love, in all its forms, was a journey, one that required patience, humility, and above all, a willingness to forgive. The road ahead was still uncertain. They both knew that. But for the first time in a long while, the future felt full of possibilities. And that, in itself, was enough. Through the years of pain and regret, there was one lesson that the father had learned more clearly than anything else: no one could ever truly control the path their lives would take. But what they could control was how they chose to handle the obstacles that came their way, the choices they made in the face of hardship. He had made a grave mistake. One that had cost him the most important relationship in his life. But in the end, it wasn't the mistake that defined him, it was the effort he put into making things right. It was the humility to admit that he had been wrong, and the patience to allow healing to take its time. The daughter, too, had learned her own valuable lesson. She had learned that holding on to anger and bitterness only weighed her down, that true freedom came from forgiveness. She had learned to let go of the past, not as a way to forget it, but as a way to free herself from its grip. Their journey was far from over. It would take time, and there would be challenges along the way. But the most important lesson they both took away was this: it wasn't the mistakes they had made, but the love and effort they put into mending what had been broken, that would define their future. In the end, the past didn't define them, what they chose to do with it, and what they chose to become, did. And that was the greatest lesson of all.